Welcome to the programme, and we're starting with some breaking news, and that is that for the first time in its history, the state of Mississippi has chosen a woman to represent them in the US Senate. Cindy Hyde-Smith, a Republican backed by President Trump, won an election clouded by racial tension. The vote was a special runoff for the last Senate seat of the midterm elections after no candidates reached 50% on the 6th of November. Well, our correspondent, Chris Buckler, is in Oxford, Mississippi for us now. So, Chris, celebrations for Republicans there and relief in Washington, I'm imagining.
Yeah, Cindy Hyde-Smith was always the favourite to win this Senate seat, but her campaign was briefly derailed by comments she made in which she said that she would turn up at a public hanging and sit in the front row if she was invited by a supporter. Now that caused a lot of controversy here in Mississippi, not least because it dredged up the past and racially motivated lynchings that had taken place here in this state. It also made it a much more competitive battle. However, she has overcome that, and she has, according to the opinion polls and according to now the results, really managed to make it a pretty decisive victory here. And that will be regarded as a win not just for her, but also for Donald Trump, who came on the eve of the election and held 2 rallies in support of Cindy Hyde-Smith. He has actually tweeted that this is a big win. And of course, it's big for him because it extends his majority inside the US Senate. It means he has 53 of the 100 seats for his Republican Party, and he will see that as being something of a victory. But I suspect there are others who will regard this as having a bit of a moral victory, if not actually winning the seat. And that is the Democratic candidate Mike Espy, who really led a very, very competitive campaign if you consider that Mississippi is regarded as a Republican stronghold. And certainly this African-American candidate was someone who gained a lot of a following, particularly after those comments from Cindy Hyde-Smith. He's also been tweeting saying that while this is not the result that he actually wanted, he still is proud of the historic campaign that he led. And he said that they built the largest grassroots organisation that the state has seen in a generation through a coalition of voters who shared their belief that Mississippi's future will be brighter than their past. It gives you a sense that some of the things that were brought up in this campaign have not been settled, that there still are tensions. But for the Republicans, they have won this Senate seat. But perhaps for Democrats, they will see this as an opportunity to perhaps build on what they did achieve during this very competitive campaign.
Chris, I know we need to wait for a breakdown of the vote, but did you get a sense that this argument galvanised African-American voters there in Mississippi?
I did. I got a real sense of that also from some younger voters as well, in which they seemed to say that they were coming out to support the Democratic candidate partly because of those comments by Cindy Hyde-Smith. There's no doubt whatsoever that they dominated this campaign. It's certainly what people in the streets were talking about. But there were also Republicans who felt that her words were twisted, that were used against her, that this was a phrase that was never really intended to bring up memories of lynchings. And as a result, there were also Republicans who came out to support her because of that. But it's made it a very, very divisive battle, as so often politics is in current America.
Chris Buckler, thank you very much. Moving on now, and a court in Crimea has ordered 12 Ukrainian servicemen captured at sea to be held for 2 months. Another 12 will be brought before the court on Wednesday. They and their 3 naval vessels were seized on Sunday near Crimea, the Ukrainian peninsula annexed by Russia in 2014. The men are not being treated as prisoners of war, but look set to face criminal charges of illegally crossing into Russia. Lebeduseka has more.
Captured at sea by Russian forces and now sentenced in a Crimean court. One of 12 Ukrainian sailors ordered to be held until January. Russia says they crossed into its waters illegally, but Ukraine insists the incident happened in areas that are free to shipping. Russia's security service has released film statements from 3 of the captured Ukrainians, which were widely shown on state TV. One said that he was aware the actions of his navy were provocative. We cannot verify the circumstances of the interviews, but Kiev says the men were forced to lie under duress. This footage, also released by Russia, apparently shows the incident which led to the crisis, the most serious escalation between the two countries in years. The Kerch Strait, where this happened, is the only way of accessing Ukraine's key ports in the Azov Sea, which both Russia and Ukraine are meant to share. But since Russia annexed Crimea 4 years ago, it's been able to block access in and out. On Monday, Ukraine imposed martial law, saying it's the victim of a deliberate act of aggression.
I don't want anyone to think this is fun and games. Ukraine is under threat of full-scale war with Russia.
The US is calling on European countries to fully enforce the sanctions on Russia over its annexation of Crimea.
It's a dangerous escalation on the part of Russians' continued aggressive behavior against Ukraine. The United States continues to support Ukraine's territorial integrity. The Secretary is heading to NATO, as many of you know, in the coming days. I would imagine that that would be a big topic of conversation.
America says Russia violated international law, and President Trump now says he might cancel a meeting with President Putin at the G20 later this week. Mr. Trump says he doesn't like what is happening, but he hopes they'll be able to straighten things out soon. Lebu Diseko, BBC News.
Let's take a look at a few more stories now. And the preliminary findings into last month's plane crash in Indonesia have said that the airline involved, Lion Air, needs to improve its safety culture. 189 people died when the Lion Air Boeing 737 crashed into the Java Sea last month. Some of the grieving families have launched a legal challenge for compensation from Boeing. President Macron of France has said that nationwide protests against higher fuel taxes will not stop him moving the country to clean energy. Mr. Macron wants all coal-fired power stations in France closed by 2022, but he says he understands the anger of the protesters. And Stephen Hillenburg, the creator of the hit children's cartoon series SpongeBob SquarePants, has died at the age of 57. He had been diagnosed with motor neurone disease. The show, which was set underwater, was inspired by Mr. Hillenburg's early career as a marine biology teacher. A blast near a chemical plant in northern China has left at least 22 people dead. The explosion in Zhangjiakou city in the province of Hebei set dozens of vehicles ablaze. Well, our China correspondent Stephen McDonnell is in Beijing for us now. Stephen, what more do we know about this?
What seems to have happened is for one of the vehicles approaching the chemical factory to have ignited a series of blasts and explosions. And you can see there's footage of dozens of trucks and cars lining the streets approaching the factory on fire, and dozens more fire trucks down those streets and putting out the fires on all these vehicles. You can imagine one of those trucks, I guess, could have had its own chemicals inside it, and whether or not it caused it itself, maybe a spark from another vehicle has ignited that or something along those lines. We're still, of course, a long way from knowing the reason for it, but it had to have been one of those vehicles started it, because the plant, although it's been shut down, it doesn't seem to have been a fire inside the plant, but on many, like dozens of cars and trucks approaching the plant. People will soon know the city of Zhangjiakou, though, of course, because it is going to host the alpine events at the 2022 Beijing Olympics. And there's been some concern that, this is an industrial city, and China, despite its fantastic record in terms of economic progress, has really struggled with safety in these sort of industrial sites. And sadly, these chemical explosions are a pretty regular occurrence here, and many of them have been quite deadly.
Stephen McDonnell in Beijing, thank you very much for that update. Stay with us here on BBC News, still to come. Lots to answer for. Campaigners and politicians ask, where's Mark Zuckerberg as Facebook faces questions over fake news?
President Kennedy was shot down and died almost immediately. The murder of John Kennedy is a disaster for the whole free world. He caught the imagination of the world, the first of a new generation of leaders.
Margaret Thatcher is resigning as leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. Before leaving number 10 to see the Queen, she told her cabinet, "It's a funny old world."
Angela Merkel is Germany's first woman chancellor, easily securing the majority she needed.
Attempts to fly a hot air balloon had to be abandoned after a few minutes, but nobody seemed to mind very much. As one local comic put it, it's not hot air we need, it's hard cash.
Cuba has declared 9 days of mourning following the death of Fidel Castro at the age of 90. Castro developed close ties with the Soviet Union in the 1960s. It was an alliance that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Hello, welcome back. You're watching BBC News, the latest headlines. The Republican candidate Cindy Hyde-Smith has won the senatorial seat in Mississippi and extended the GOP's majority in the Senate. And Donald Trump has threatened to pull out of a meeting with President Putin as Russia's conflict with Ukraine intensifies. The British government has expressed concern at the significant increase in migrant boats crossing the English Channel. Home Secretary Sajid Javid says the traffic is being organised by criminal gangs, and he's promised more cooperation with the French authorities. This month alone, 110 migrants, many saying they are Iranian nationals, have made it to Kent on the English coast. All of them have been passed to immigration officials. The French police say they believe the recent surge is down to tighter security at the Eurotunnel entrance and also because of Brexit, with migrants wanting to get to the UK before it happens. Our correspondent Colin Campbell reports.
Rescued off the coast of Dover in an inflatable dinghy. These are migrants from northern France trying to get to Britain. In the last few months there's been a surge this kind of activity. A migrant camp in Dunkirk we're secretly filming using an undercover researcher. It's smugglers like this man who are at the heart of the problem, willing to risk lives for financial gain.
A boat, it will cost you £3,000 to £4,000. I'm taking 3 people with me. They pay in cash. We get a boat and off we go.
He says he was a fisherman in Iran and getting us across the channel would be easy.
Look, I will check the weather. You have waves in the sea, ferries cross the water, and they can drag you underneath them even if you're 1 kilometer away. But I know the sea routes where you will not be disrupted by the ferries.
More than 100 migrants have reached the Kent coast by boat in the last 3 weeks, but not all that depart succeed. Farhad from Afghanistan was put in a dinghy with 11 others. He was rescued at night after the engine stalled. He thought he was going to die.
It was freezing a couple of days ago, and when you get wet, we were full wet. I was like that to myself. A couple of guys, they actually fainted, you know, they fainted, they were sleeping, and we're trying to wake them up. And we're trying to wake them up because their hearts will stop from the cold.
This migrant told me the boat he was in capsized after being battered by waves. Living in a squalid makeshift camp in Calais, they claim they fled their countries because of religious and political persecution. Their desperation to get to the UK is being fueled by fears of Brexit. How many of you think that it's going to get harder? Harder, put your hands up. You all think it's going to get harder. There is a rush.
Everybody's talking about it in here in the jungle. They're like that, we need to get in quicker, you know what I'm saying, in case the security gets tied up.
Even as winter sets in and temperatures start to plummet here, migrants in this part of north of France are continuing to prepare to cross this treacherous stretch of water. It's happening at night time in the dark, and they're using their mobile phones to navigate across to the Kent coast. Waiting to catch a dinghy to the UK, these Iranian migrants told me they'd paid £6,000 each and were waiting to be taken to a nearby beach by smugglers.
We have to go by boat. We know we are putting our life in danger. I've tried before, but the waves were 3 meters high and came up over the boat. I already stared death in the face.
There are fears drowned migrants could wash up onto Calais beaches.
Migrants trying to cross are risking their lives every night here in Calais. Is the French authorities doing enough? Well, we try to stop them. We stopped quite every boat that tried to cross the channel, but we need to face the truth. The truth is we cannot stop everyone.
Overloaded with migrants, this was the boat stopped by French authorities this morning. They were rescued, but there's real fear lives may soon be lost.
Colin Campbell in Dover there. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will meet his counterpart from Mexico's new government on Sunday for talks over a possible deal that would see asylum seekers wait in Mexico while their claims are processed. A caravan of thousands of migrants, made up largely of Hondurans, has in recent days started to arrive at the US border. Our correspondent Will Grant has sent this update from a migrant camp in Tijuana.
The migrants' camp here in Tijuana is reaching a sort of critical mass after the first caravan of migrants from Honduras was caught up with by a second and third with people from El Salvador and Guatemala. The result is that there are thousands of people in this space that simply isn't adequate for them. There isn't enough space, there isn't enough food, and as you can see around me, every square meter of this area has been taken up with by a cheap tent or temporary accommodation put together with plastic sheeting, tarpaulins and pieces of wood. Of course, the migrants are generating a lot of rubbish, a lot of waste. Amnesty International have described the conditions here as squalid, and having been around the camp for some time now, it would be difficult to disagree with that assessment. After the protest on Sunday, which was met with tear gas fired from the US side of the border, Mexico has requested an investigation from the US authorities as to what happened. And the migrants themselves have a few choices to make. Some will choose to stay here in Tijuana, where temporary work visas may be made available. Others have already decided to go home, deciding that enough is enough and that these conditions aren't sustainable. Others still will continue to try to cross that border wall that you can see behind me and make it into the United States, either legally or illegally. But either way, Christmas is coming in due course. The nights are getting much colder and people will be here probably well into the new year.
Will Grant in Tijuana. Efforts to tackle climate change are way off track. That's according to the United Nations, which is hosting a major climate conference in Poland next week. Last year, greenhouse gas emissions reached a record high, and it's not just a matter of industrial pollution. Food is also a factor, with livestock producing methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. Our science editor David Schuckman reports on how our food choices have an impact on the planet.
Every breath from a cow, and especially every burp, releases methane, 600 litres every day. Most from the front end, not the back. And because methane warms the planet, the more we eat beef and dairy products, the more the temperatures rise. At this farm, researchers encourage the cows to feed inside this hood, so they can measure the methane.
So a cow came in, she was eating.
Professor Chris Reynolds explains what they've found.
And she had 5 eructations, or 5 belches.
So each spike is a burp, is it, effectively?
That's a burp or a belch. There's been a huge increase in meat and milk consumption. That demand's going to continue, so I think we need strategies for sustainably producing that meat and milk.
One option is adding special supplements to the feed. Some of these make the cows a lot less gassy. So technically, it is possible to reduce the extraordinary amount of methane that cows produce, but on its own, that won't be enough to head off the worst of global warming. So it comes down to the key and highly controversial question of what we all choose to eat. Here at Manchester University, researchers study the climate cost of food. The fertilisers, tractors and processing all generate gases that cause more warming. So add all that up, and these...
They had demanded the boss, and they weren't happy that Mark Zuckerberg declined their invitation. So the Facebook executive sent in his place came under immediate attack from a Canadian MP at this multinational hearing.
Our democratic institutions, our form of civil conversation, seem to have been upended by frat boy billionaires from California. So Mr. Zuckerberg's decision not to appear here at Westminster to me speaks volumes.
And the pressure continued to mount.
Facebook cannot be trusted to make the right assessment on what can properly appear on its platform.
It has become a serious threat to modern democracy.
Do you accept that Facebook needs to be regulated?
At the weekend, documents were seized by a Commons official from an American executive whose firm, maker of an app hunting down bikini photos, is in a legal dispute with Facebook.
Why didn't Facebook disclose that?
The man who ordered this highly unusual move described one seized email, which he said suggested Facebook had known about Russian interference for years.
An engineer at Facebook notified the company in October 2014 that entities with Russian IP addresses have been using a Pinterest API key to pull over 3 billion data points a day through the ordered Friends API. Now, was that reported to any external body at the time?
Facebook later released a statement saying the engineers who'd flagged their concerns subsequently looked into this further and found no evidence of specific Russian activity. Mark Zuckerberg may have been a no-show today, but the political pressure on his company shows no sign of letting up. Rory Catherine-Jones, BBC News.
And finally from me this hour, sometimes it pays to stand out from the crowd, especially if you're a cow that goes by the name of Knickers from Western Australia. His owner, Jeff Pearson, tried to sell him at auction last month, but meat processors said they couldn't take Knickers as he's just too big. The 7-year-old is among the largest of his kind in the world, weighing, wait for it, 1.4 tonnes and 2 metres tall. That's one animal you wouldn't want any beef with. I'm sorry. You're watching BBC News. I'm Duncan Golestani. You can find me on Twitter if you want to. But for now, thank you very much for your company, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Hello there. We've replaced our cold, dry weather now with something a lot more unsettled, wet, windy and much milder conditions, which will be with us, in fact, for the next few days. Now, through today, this next area of low pressure means business. It's going to be quite a deep area of low, bringing gales and heavy rain. In fact, there could be some disruption to travel throughout today, so keep tuned to your BBC local radio for all the local updates there. Now, we're starting the day off, though, on a pretty mild note. We've lost the overnight frost that we've seen for the last week or so. Temperatures starting off around 6 to 8 degrees. Now, we're dragging this milder air from the Azores on a southwesterly wind. Might not feel so mild, though, because of the gales and the rain, but it really will be milder than what we've been used to. Spells of pretty heavy rain through the morning, moving northwards, followed by some showery bursts of rain further south during the afternoon, and an area of much heavier persistent rain for Scotland, where we could see some pretty high rainfall totals on the hills there. Temperatures double figures for all, as high as 14 or 15 across the southeast, but it's going to be very windy indeed. 60-65 miles an hour in exposure across western coast, and then later in the day closer to 70 miles an hour parts of the northeast of Scotland and the Northern Isles. And it's a brief window of fine weather during Wednesday evening before the next bout of wet and windy weather starts to spread into the south of the country as we head into the early part of Thursday. Now, there could be a very windy spell of weather across parts of Wales and the western half of England through Thursday morning as this next little area of low pressure moves northeastwards, and with it again a spell of pretty heavy rain, which will clear through, and by Thursday afternoon we should see a little bit of brightness breaking out. Just a few blustery showers, maybe heavy and thundery across southwestern areas. Temperatures down a degree or so on Wednesday's values, closer to 9 to 13 degrees. As we end the week, low pressure still very much in charge. Again, very windy, particularly across northern areas. As you can see, tightly packed isobars there. But it's going to be, I think, a bright day on Friday. Most of the showers, blustery showers, will be across northern and western areas, and these will be increasingly wintry over the hills. as it will be a chillier day across the north, but very blustery again. A risk of gales across Scotland, maybe into the far north of England. Blustery across the south, but not quite as windy as it'll be further north. And you'll notice a little bit cooler, temperatures of 9 to 10 or 11 Celsius. As we head on in towards the weekend, we maintain an unsettled theme, quite blustery, strong southwesterly winds, again fairly mild across England and Wales, something a bit cooler though for Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Stories set to shape the news agenda. Headlines freshly written. Original perspectives on the day's unfolding narratives. See the bigger picture as it emerges. The papers, tonight at 10:30 and 11:30 on the BBC News Channel.
Follow the story, whatever you're doing, wherever you are. You can follow every moment in depth with BBC News. Get the full story at bbc.co.uk/news. Get the headlines as they happen with the breaking news alert. And keep up with events by watching the BBC News channel in the app. Follow the story wherever you are with BBC News.
Hello, this is BBC News, the latest headlines. For the first time in its history, Mississippi has chosen a woman to represent the state in the US Senate. Republican Cindy Hyde-Smith's win also extends the GOP's majority in the Senate to 6. Donald Trump says he may pull out of a meeting with President Putin because of the situation in Ukraine. President Trump says he wants more details about the detention of Ukrainian sailors and 3 Navy ships after a tense confrontation over the Crimea. And the British government says there's been a significant increase in migrant boats crossing the English Channel. Home Secretary Sajid Javid says the traffic is being organised by criminal gangs, and he's promised more cooperation with the French authorities. It's estimated 110 migrants have made it across in the last month. Now on BBC News, it's Hard Talk.
Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacker. On December the 11th, 2.5 years of posturing, politicking and poisonous disagreement come to a head. The UK Parliament will vote on whether to accept the Brexit deal Prime Minister Theresa May has negotiated with the EU. And her case boils down to this: it is the least worst option. But many in her own party, as well as the opposition, simply don't buy it. My guest is former Government Minister Jo Johnson, who resigned in order to oppose this deal. Does he have a credible alternative? Jo Johnson, welcome to Hard Talk.
Great to be here.
When you quit the government just a couple of weeks ago, you came out with this very powerful statement. You described Brexit as a failure of British statecraft on a scale unseen since the Suez crisis. Now, you have been intimately connected with the Brexit project from the very beginning. So do you feel a very deep sense of guilt?
Look, I feel we're in an appalling situation right now, and the government is presenting us with a choice which is completely unacceptable, and that's what I was referring to. It's the choice which the government is framing between the Prime Minister's deal on the one hand, which is going to trap us in this client-subordinate relationship with the EU for the foreseeable future, and then on the other hand, the threat of a chaotic exit, a no-deal exit that's going to be disastrous for our business community and lead to all manner of chaos for residents in my constituency in Orpington, because we'll see traffic backed up from the Channel ports up the M20 and along the M26. Unimaginable chaos, and that's a completely false choice for the government to present us with, and that's what I said is a failure of statecraft.
Yes, but that phrase is such a grandiose phrase that surely we can't just place all of the blame on decisions taken in the last few weeks and months. My point to you, and your intimate connection, is that you go back to the very beginning of this. You were one of the key architects of that Conservative manifesto when David Cameron was the leader of your party, which pledged to the British public an in-out referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. So if we're to talk about statecraft in the widest sense, do you accept that you have to take a share of the blame?
Yes, of course. I certainly feel responsible in part for the situation the country finds itself in.
But of course that was a mistake. The referendum decision in its origin with David Cameron, with you, was a mistake.
The origins of internal Conservative Party tensions over Europe long predate me, and they go back many decades.
Of course,
indeed,
but the fundamental decision to try to lance that boil, so to speak, by having an in-out referendum, which had been avoided for an awful long time as a proposition inside the Conservative Party, it was a decision taken by David Cameron, advised by people such as yourself. So it is interesting to me that you, on reflection, seem to be saying that was a fundamental mistake.
David Cameron took the decision to hold a referendum in January 2013 in a speech to Bloomberg at its headquarters in London, and that actually predated my arrival on the scene. But nonetheless, I certainly helped him and George Osborne put together the 2015 manifesto, on which we won a majority, and that included, as you rightly say, the commitment to hold a referendum and to implement the result. And do I think that was a mistake? No. On balance, I think holding the referendum was the right thing to do. I think the campaign on both sides was not a strong campaign. It was full of reckless promises, undeliverable commitments to the British people, which are now coming home to roost. And that's what we're having to unpick. And that's what we've been unpicking over the subsequent 28 months. The Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, Theresa May, has been honouring our commitment in that 2015 manifesto to deliver the result and to honour that result, and she's concluded this massive agreement, 585 pages of the withdrawal agreement, 26 pages of rather high-level waffle in the political declaration, and that constitutes the deal on which, as you said in your introduction, Parliament is going to vote in just over a fortnight's time.
And you have, if I may stop you just for a sec, you have sat in government with important positions, higher education and transportation more recently. You've sat in a government which has tried to find a compromise, to deliver on the result of the referendum, to get Britain out of the European Union, but in a way that delivers as frictionless an economic relationship with the EU as possible. And it seems to me that, with all of its pluses and minuses, is what Theresa May has come up with.
Well, we have a deal now. It's the product of 2.5 years of negotiation, but in my mind, it's the worst of all worlds. It really is hopeless, and it was for that reason that I took the decision that I could no longer stay in the government. Very difficult to reach.
You only took it at the sort of last minute of the last hour, because you've been sitting in government, watching Theresa May and her advisors move toward this deal for an awful long time, and you were supportive of it.
Precisely because I felt we had a duty to honour the referendum result. That's why I voted to start the Article 50 process back at the beginning of 2017. And then that's why I kept my peace within government and allowed the Prime Minister the greatest possible manoeuvre to reach a deal that was in the national interest. Now, it was only when the deal came back and we saw its emerging shape in the Chequers agreement over the summer, it was only when the deal came back and I could see that it was going to land us in the worst of all possible worlds, trapped in this subordinate relationship with the EU without any gains in sovereignty, but at massive economic cost, the very opposite of what was promised, that I realised I could no longer be part of it and I could no longer support it.
Theresa May's letter to the nation says this: "We will," she says, "as a result of my deal, the one she's negotiated after so much effort, we will take back control of our borders by putting an end to free movement of people once and for all. We will take back control of our money, ending the vast annual payments to the EU. We will take back control of our laws, ending the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in the UK." Those are three fundamental pillars she is delivering.
Well, I strongly disagree. I think the Brexit as billed is not being delivered. We are not gaining control of our trade policy. The EU will continue to set our framework for trade because we'll be within the single customs territory. So as President Trump said this morning, this is a good deal for the EU, but it's not going to facilitate UK trade deals with countries outside of the EU, such as the US.
Well, with respect, you don't know that because you don't know the future trade relationship that will ultimately be negotiated in the second phase of this between Britain and the European Union. So you don't know how free Britain will be to negotiate free trade deals with other third-party countries.
Well, there are some basic realities here, which is the EU is a market that's 5 times the size of the UK market. We're going to need to negotiate access to that market, and part of the whole package of our future relationship that's foreshadowed in the political declaration is that the provision for our membership of the single customs territory is going to be at the very heart of it. So the EU is going to shape our trade policy, and that's why President Trump is essentially right. It's not going to be possible for us to craft meaningful trade deals with third countries such as the US.
For those people who don't follow the ins and outs of British politics every single day, some will not know that you were an ardent Remainer. Now, surely underpinning your position today is the fact that you believe leaving the European Union is a terrible decision for Britain in any case. And what you have chosen to do at the 11th, well, the last minute of the last hour of this process is actually act upon your fundamental instinct, which is to try to block Brexit happening at all.
Well, I wanted the PM to bring back a great deal that was in the national interest, and I suspended disbelief for the last 2.5 years that she might do so. In reality, we saw in the summer, as the Chequers proposals emerged, and then with this final deal that's come out of Brussels more recently, that we are going to be trapped in the worst of all possible worlds, and I don't want to be party to that.
A point. I mentioned politicking and poisonous atmospheres in my introduction. Just a point of interest to me, but also of political principle. When the Chequers deal was sort of created in the summer, your brother, who obviously was a very senior figure in the government, the Foreign Secretary, after 2 days of consideration, he flounced out of the government. He quit, making a very big noise, saying it represented what he called a suicide vest wrapped around the body of the British body politic. You, at the time, were still not in the cabinet, but still a senior minister. You didn't say a word. You didn't say anything. Why not?
Well, at that point, the negotiations with the EU were still ongoing, and I didn't want to do anything that would limit the Prime Minister's freedom of manoeuvre. So I didn't want to be accused of tying her hands and weakening our negotiating position in Brussels. That's why I kept my peace until she'd actually reached an agreement, pretty much. And so it was at that point that I felt that I'd done my duty. I'd allowed her maximum space to negotiate a deal, but I concluded it wasn't going to be in our national interest. It's going to leave us poorer and less in control than we were before. It's utterly pointless.
But it's not going to leave us poorer than leaving the European Union with no deal whatsoever, is it?
No, that's true, but that's not the relevant benchmark.
Well, it may well be the very relevant benchmark, because to many people's minds, including constitutionalists and political observers, if Theresa May does not win a majority for this deal in the House of Commons, the ultimate direction of travel is to a no deal, some call it a crash-out Brexit, on March 29th, 2019.
But that's precisely the false choice which the government is presenting to MPs and to the country as a whole, which I'm rejecting. Of course we have other options. That's why I feel it's important that we actually give the people a chance to now say whether they want to proceed with Brexit. Now that we actually know what Brexit is, it's not the idealised
position to take.
No, not at all. It's not the idealised.
You're ignoring everything that is happening around you. For example, Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, is saying this is the best deal Britain can get. In fact, it is the only deal that the EU will consider giving to the UK. And if it doesn't take it, the clear implication is there'll be no renegotiation, there'll be no further negotiation. This is it.
But I'm not suggesting a renegotiation of the text. I think the Prime Minister has probably got the best deal that Britain could get under the circumstances. What I'm saying is, now that we know what the concrete reality of a negotiated Brexit is, that we go back to the people and say, you wanted Brexit, this is the negotiated Brexit which the Prime Minister has delivered. It is the only Brexit that's negotiable, that's on the table. Now over to you. If you want it, this is it. If you don't want it, there is an opportunity to reconsider that decision.
Are you a gambler? I mean, instinctively, as a person, are you a risk taker and a gambler?
Look, I think it's important to be entrepreneurial in life. I support people who take risks and put themselves on the line for things. And if you want to stand by your convictions in politics, sometimes you have to do that.
Because this is the most extraordinary risk that you are suggesting the whole nation take. And it's a risk that, if it goes wrong, is going to cost the nation enormously. Is there not an arrogance in you demanding the nation take that sort of risk?
Listen, I'm just a backbench MP putting their views out. It's for other members of Parliament and the country as a whole to determine whether they want to take any notice of me. All I'm saying is we now know what Brexit looks like because the Prime Minister and the government have spent 2.5 years negotiating it. I think it would be a travesty of democracy to ignore the public, let alone what I think, ignore the public and say this is the Brexit you're going to get, like it or not. Because actually, when I look at my mailbag as a constituency MP, I see my residents in Orpington telling me they don't want this Brexit. Neither Remainers nor Leavers want this Brexit, and that's because it's the worst of all worlds.
Well, I want to come to your proposition, the referendum, in just a moment, but just to consider this idea of risk a little bit more. I mean, Theresa May said this in the Commons yesterday. She said, no one knows what will happen if this deal doesn't pass, but it will open the door to more division, more uncertainty, and all of the risk that that will entail. You surely, whatever you think of her judgments in the last few weeks, you surely agree with that.
No, I think proceeding on this basis with a flawed, botched Brexit that leaves us in the worst of all worlds will leave everybody unhappy. Conservative Party will be blamed for bungling Brexit, for saddling the country with a half-in, half-out relationship that leaves us poorer and less in control than we were before. We won't be forgiven for that.
On the contrary, surely there's a message here that resonates with everything Churchill said about democracy, which, to sum it up and paraphrase it, was that it's the least worst system. It's not good, but it's better than all the other available systems. I think the profoundly
conservative approach to things is to leave things as they are if you don't have a better solution. We don't have a better solution than the arrangements we currently enjoy within the EU, and that's what I think we should put back to the British people. We say we got the negotiated Brexit the Prime Minister secured. You either want that, or you stay in the EU, or you crash out altogether with no deal at all.
OK, so let's really unpick then this proposition of a second referendum. Let us go back to the beginning. You're the man who wrote the manifesto which said that the Conservative Party promises the British people now referendum which will settle the matter of Britain and Europe once and for all. You're now the man who appears to be going back to the same public and saying, whatever I promised you before about an in-out referendum that would settle the matter was complete rubbish. I don't like the result we got, so we're going to do it all again. That's just not credible.
Well, it potentially will settle the matter. We put the deal that the Prime Minister has negotiated in full transparency back to the public. If they want to accept that deal, that's it.
But you've said that once already. You use up your credibility when you come back and say, oh, we're just going to do it again.
To a certain extent, but I think actually you've got to realise that the referendum that we had in June 2016 is not the same as the decision we would be asking the public to make now. We have before us 585 pages of a legal agreement plus a 26-page political declaration. This is the Brexit reality. If people want it, let's buy that, not the fantastical visions that were presented in June 2016.
Just in brief, there are a few specific mechanics here I don't understand. I mean, the British Parliament has passed an EU Withdrawal Act, and that and the EU's treaty says that, or at least the Article 50 rules say that we're leaving, absolutely categorically leaving, on March 29th, 2019. Now, I don't understand, least of all in timing, how you could get a referendum which requires parliamentary legislation and a very complex process to set it in train, how you could possibly get that done before the clock runs out on March 29th, 2019.
No, of course, you're right. You wouldn't get it done by the 29th of March 2019, and it would require the agreement of our European partners to suspend the Article 50 process or extend the Article 50 process to give us time, a few extra months, to hold that referendum. And in terms of the process, Parliament...
Just in parentheses, there is no majority in the British Parliament, as far as anyone can tell, to get any of that done.
At the time, as things stand today, that's probably true. I would concede that. But this is a very dynamic situation, and I think everyone will recognise that if the Prime Minister's deal is voted down in a couple of weeks' time, I think everybody in Parliament will be looking for a way through, and one of the most obvious ways through is a referendum that puts this question back to the British people.
Only, Joe Johnson, if you can answer the most basic question of all, what's the question on the paper, the ballot paper for this second referendum?
Well, ultimately, it will be MPs in Parliament who legislate and who craft the question.
But
and
you
they
must have
will
thought about it, because you're telling me this is the only way out.
And it won't be for me alone, but I'll come to that. It will come to that. Parliament will legislate. There will be extensive debates in Parliament. The Electoral Commission will test the question as legislation goes through the House of Commons. What I think is important for the question is that it doesn't disenfranchise strong groups within society, people who've got strong views for Leave, strong views for Remain, and strong views in support of the Prime Minister's deal.
You've already laid out 3 different territories there. So are you suggesting this won't be a binary referendum? I don't see how a non-binary referendum can work.
It's quite possible that it isn't a non-binary referendum, but I think what's relevant is that Parliament ultimately will determine the question on the advice given to it by the Electoral Commission.
If you would, frame for me, as you say, it's not your decision, it'll be a collective decision in the end, but frame for me, because you're an important player in this debate, frame for me a question that you think would work.
You're familiar with how we elect mayors in metro cities across the country, in London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool and so on. We use a system of a preferential vote with a first preference whereby you identify the candidate you want to be mayor most, and then you identify the person you could live with as the second choice. And progressively, as candidates are eliminated, those who give them their second preference votes are redistributed. It's a system of voting which we are now familiar with in at least 6 metro mayor elections across the country. It's a system which is well understood and which can easily be deployed in the event that Parliament decides there needs to be 3 options: Remain, Leave without a deal, or Leave with the Prime Minister's deal that's been negotiated over the last 2.5 years.
What you've just outlined is complicated.
Well, it is if you want it to be. I don't think it has to be. We quite successfully elect mayors in London. We have done using this system on a number of occasions. We now have become more familiar in other parts of
London is one thing, but a decision which all agree, and we started with a quote from you, a very grandiose quote about historic decisions more important and more challenging than anything since Suez. I mean, we're not talking about electing the mayor of London or Manchester. We're talking about something that will shape Britain for the next 50, arguably 100 years.
I think you underestimate the ability of voters to determine what they want between complicated options. They quite easily manage to read party manifestos and make choices based on different parties' manifestos. They quite easily choose between candidates representing up to 10 different political parties. I think it's to undermine the ability of the electorate, or to underestimate the ability of the electorate.
A no-deal Brexit could damage the economy to the tune of 8% or more of GDP by 2030. You're rolling the dice, accepting that that is a part of your gamble.
Well, if MPs choose to put that particular scenario on the ballot paper, then ultimately...
Well, you said yourself it would have to be on the ballot paper to be fair to the public.
Ultimately, that would be one of the possible outcomes. I would obviously argue strongly against a no-deal outcome of that sort, and I'm sure the entire business community would as well. I can't believe there are many MPs in Parliament who would welcome that.
But of course, the point is you have an opportunity right now, if you and other MPs were to support Theresa May with her, what she would acknowledge as a compromise deal, you have the opportunity to absolutely be sure Britain will avoid that fate. But you're rolling the dice.
Well, look, I do think the Prime Minister's deal has extraordinary flaws. It will leave us poorer. It will leave us less in control. We won't get any of the advantages of Brexit in terms of an ability to do trade deals, an ability to turbocharge our economy and deregulate it and lower taxes and change all manner of standards, which was the Brexit vision. None of that is going to come to pass. And that's why I think it would be a travesty of democracy if we didn't go back to people and say, is this the Brexit you actually want?
In the 1840s, arguments over the Corn Laws, trade and tariffs, they destroyed the Conservative Party for an awful long time, decades. That is happening again. Your party is going to be destroyed over the next few weeks, isn't it?
Well, I think it's important that we come together. I think the party...
No, come on. People aren't coming together. You and your brother have fallen out completely over this.
My brother and I are in total agreement on the question of the need to reject this deal.
Absolutely, rejecting the deal, but from completely different ends of the perspective. Boris Johnson, former Foreign Secretary, he has called it, and I'm going to use his language, shameful capitulation and surrender, vassalage, colonisation, enslavement, a suicide vest around the body of Britain. That's his language from the point of view view of an ardent, passionate Brexiter. You are now an ardent advocate of a referendum and a hope that people would vote to remain. You're at completely opposite ends of the spectrum in the same party.
But whether you're Remain or Leave, or whether you're a Remainer or a Brexiteer, all of us care about being in control of our lawmaking process. It's inherent in our democracy that you have to have the consent of the governed, and that's what we're really losing over the regulation of vast swathes of our economy with the Prime Minister's deal, and that's completely unsustainable and unacceptable for a democracy such as ours.
Surely what is unsustainable is the current state of the Conservative Party.
Well, look, I don't deny the party's divided. Who could? But the important thing is we don't do something because it's on the table. It's a bad option and we shouldn't accept it. We need to go back to the people, ask them to confirm that this is the Brexit that they actually want. And if it's not, then let's pause and give them the option to stay in the European Union.
In all honesty, what do you think this Brexit crisis has done, is doing, will do to Britain's political fabric?
Well, look, clearly it's a difficult time in politics. The opportunity cost of Brexit is enormous. We are wasting so much brain power across government, across the country, that could be better deployed solving the real causes of Brexit, our low productivity, our poor social mobility, our housing crisis, income inequality.